the day Micah Kendrick rode into Creston Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883. Not a single soul at the Silver Pail Saloon would have wagered a plugged nickel that the stone-faced man with the worn duster and the quiet, hollowed-out eyes would be smiling before summer's end. And they surely would have doubled that wager if they'd known the reason would be a woman with flour on her hands and a wit sharper than a Bowie knife. Micah had not always been a man carved from silence. There had been a time, somewhere back in the wreckage of his own personal history, when he had laughed at supper tables, when he had tipped his hat to ladies with a grin instead of a nod, when the lines of his face had been worn into easy patterns of warmth. But that was 7 years gone now, buried under a headstone in Abilene, Kansas, beside the woman and the infant son who had not survived the fever of 1876. He had been 24 years old when he lost them. He had ridden south and west afterward, following work and distance with equal desperation, and somewhere along the way he had simply stopped smiling, not as a decision, not as a vow. It had just happened the way rivers go dry slowly, then completely, until you could walk across where the water used to run and feel nothing but cracked earth beneath your boots. He was 31 now. He had spent 7 years as a ranch hand, a cattle driver, a fence mender, a man for hire in the honest trades of the open range. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble away his wages. He did not pick fights. He was, by every observable measure, a decent, steady, unremarkable man, except for the fact that no one had seen him smile since he'd crossed the Rio Grande heading west, and no one had tried very hard to change that, because the look in his dark eyes discouraged that kind of effort the way a storm front discourages a picnic. He came to Creston Flats because Walt Greer, who owned the largest working cattle ranch in that part of the territory, had put out word that he needed a foreman. It wasn't a job Micah had sought before. Foreman meant responsibility, and responsibility meant attachment, and attachment was something he had spent 7 years carefully dismantling. But he was 31 and tired in the bones in a way that rest never quite fixed, and something in him, some small, stubborn ember, had whispered that maybe staying put for longer than a season was not such a terrible idea. He met Walt Greer on a Tuesday afternoon and was hired by Wednesday morning. The Greer Ranch, called the Double G, sat 4 miles east of town, spread wide across a shallow valley where a creek ran clear in the wet season and went pale and thin in the dry. There were 6 permanent hands already on the payroll, a cook named Old Pete who was approximately 70 years old and held very firm opinions about the proper preparation of beans. And this was the detail no one had mentioned to Micah during the hiring, Walt Greer's niece, who had arrived 3 weeks prior from Santa Fe and showed no immediate signs of leaving. Her name was Rosa Garner. Micah first saw her on the afternoon he rode up to the main house to receive his formal introduction to the property. She was in the yard beside the well, hanging freshly washed linens on a rope strung between 2 wooden posts, her dark hair pinned up but coming loose in the afternoon wind in the way that hair always does when it has better ideas than its owner. She was wearing a practical blue dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and there was, as would become characteristic of her, a dusting of flour across the left side of her apron, suggesting she had come from some kitchen endeavor and been recruited to the laundry before she had properly finished with the baking. She glanced at him when he rode up. He tipped his hat. She did not tip anything in return, but she looked at him with a directness that he was not accustomed to, brown eyes that took a frank accounting of a man without being rude about it. And then she went back to her linens with no ceremony whatsoever. Walt Greer appeared on the porch and waved him inside, and that was the introduction. Micah unsaddled his horse, got the lay of the bunkhouse, learned the names of the other hands, Caleb, Dutch, Tamaz, Everett, Silas, and young Danny, who was 18 and new to ranch work and terrified of snakes in an environment that was largely composed of them, and settled into the work with the ease of a man who had been doing this particular kind of work his entire adult life. He learned about Rosa Garner in pieces, the way you learn things on a ranch where nobody has much cause for long conversations. She was 26 years old, Walt had mentioned in an offhand way, as if delivering inventory. Her parents had both passed, her father 2 years ago from a riding accident, her mother from pneumonia the winter following. She had been living in Santa Fe, working as a seamstress and taking in mending, but the arrangement had grown difficult after a disagreement with her employer that Walt had not elaborated upon, and so she had come to the Double G with her single trunk and her quiet self-possession, and Walt had been enormously relieved to have her because old Pete was, and this was stated with affection, an extraordinary disaster with anything more complex than beans and cornbread. Rosa Garner could cook. This became immediately, empirically obvious. On his second night at the Double G, Micah sat down at the long supper table in the bunkhouse where the hands ate together and found before him a meal of roasted chicken with root vegetables and a gravy that had been seasoned with something he could not identify, but that made the back of his throat feel warm in the best possible way. The men around him ate with the specific focused reverence of people who have recently been converted to a better religion. "She make this?" Micah asked Caleb, who sat to his left. Caleb, who was 42 and laconic, nodded once. "Every night since she got here." That was the full extent of the conversation, because further conversation would have required stopping eating, and no one was willing to do that. Rosa herself did not eat with the hands. She took her meals at the main house with Walt, which was proper enough for the time and place. But she came to the bunkhouse kitchen each evening to prepare the supper, and Micah began, without quite deciding to be aware of the sounds of that, the movement in the kitchen, the smell of whatever was cooking, the occasional quiet humming she did when she thought no one could hear. He did not think much about it. He was a man who did not think much about things that were not directly in front of him needing doing. The first time they had a proper conversation was 2 weeks into his tenure as foreman, when a section of the north fence came down in a night storm, and 3 of Walt's best steers got out into the eastern scrubland. Micah had been out since before dawn organizing the recovery effort, and had come back to the main yard at noon with 2 of the 3 steers, and a cut along his left forearm from a thorny mesquite that had drawn blood through his shirt. He was at the water trough, rolling up his sleeve to assess the damage, when Rosa came out of the main house with a basket of vegetables she was bringing to the kitchen and stopped when she saw the blood. "That needs cleaning," she said, not a question, not particularly a suggestion, a statement of observable fact delivered with the same directness as her initial look. "It's fine," he said. "It has thorns in it," she said, setting down her basket. "I can see them from here." He looked down at his arm. She was correct. There were, in fact, 2 small thorns still embedded in the cut. He had not noticed. "I'll get to it," he said. "You'll get infection in it if you let it sit," she said, and she went inside the main house and came back out 2 minutes later with a cloth, a small brown bottle of carbolic wash, and the kind of expression that suggested she had not particularly asked his permission and was not planning to. He sat on the edge of the water trough because it seemed like the path of least resistance, and she cleaned the cut with a matter-of-fact efficiency that was somehow more comfortable than fussing would have been. She removed the thorns with a small pair of tweezers she produced from her apron pocket. She did not make a great deal of it. She did not inquire at length about his well-being. When she was finished, she wrapped the arm in a strip of clean cloth and said, "Don't get it wet for a day if you can help it," and picked up her vegetable basket and continued to the kitchen. Micah sat looking at the neatly wrapped cloth on his arm for a moment before going back to work. He noticed, after that she was always precise like that. She did not waste movement or words. She was not cold. She was warm with Walt, patient with young Danny when he came to the kitchen door asking if there was anything extra, kind in small practical ways to the hands who brought firewood or fixed things around the main house. But she was not given to performance. She said what she meant and meant what she said and did not pad either direction. He found this, without examining it carefully, unusually restful. The other thing he noticed was that she was funny, not in a broad, theatrical way, in a quiet, sideways way that could catch you unprepared. He first encountered this at the supper table. Walt had started, after about a month of Micah's tenure, inviting his foreman to eat at the main house on Sunday evenings. It was a gesture of respect, recognizing Micah's position, and Micah had accepted with a nod, and the understanding that Walt mostly wanted to talk about ranch business in a comfortable chair after supper. Rosa cooked these Sunday meals too, and she ate at the table alongside them, which meant that for the first time Micah was in regular close proximity to her for an extended period. The first Sunday supper was civil and mostly businesslike. Walt talked about the cattle prices out of Albuquerque, the state of the fence on the western section, whether they should think about expanding the remuda. Rosa listened and occasionally offered a practical observation. Micah answered Walt's questions and did not volunteer information that wasn't asked for. The second Sunday supper, Caleb had come to the main house late that afternoon with a report that one of the ranch dogs had apparently developed a deep personal grievance against the windmill on the south pasture and would not stop barking at it during working hours. Walt found this funny. Rosa found this funny. Micah did not find it funny exactly, but he acknowledged that it was a problem. "Could try moving the windmill," Rosa said. Walt laughed. "Can't move a windmill, Rosa." "I know," she said pleasantly, "which means the dog wins." Walt laughed again. Micah looked at his plate and said nothing, but there was something in his chest that shifted very slightly, like a stone that has been sitting in one place so long that it takes a single day of rain to begin loosening. The third Sunday supper was when it actually happened. It was June by then, warm enough that the windows were open, and there was a red-orange quality to the evening light that made everything on the table glow. Walt had been telling a story about his younger days in Texas, a story that Micah had gathered was probably told regularly and had accumulated some embellishment over the years. In this particular iteration, Walt had been involved in a cattle drive where one of the crew had brought along a rooster for reasons never fully established, and the rooster had managed to become the de facto leader of the lead cattle, which had led to considerable confusion at the river crossing. Walt finished the story with considerable satisfaction and looked to his audience. Micah had been listening with the polite attention of a man who is not unkind but has heard many ranch stories, and Rosa had been listening with a small smile. Then she said, very quietly and without any particular performance, "I suppose that answers the question of which way the cattle were crossing." Walt blinked, not immediately following. Micah started to nod along with the vague motion of someone processing polite conversation, and then the actual meaning of what she had said, the reference to the old question, the neat inversion of it applied to Walt's story, the layered absurdity of it delivered in that absolutely composed tone, arrived in his mind a full second behind his face. He forgot to stop. He was smiling, actually smiling. Not the small, controlled, quickly extinguished expressions that occasionally and involuntarily cross the faces of even the most determinedly solemn people, but a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and changed the entire geography of his face, and it lasted for a full several seconds before he became aware of it. When he became aware of it, it stopped, but not before Rosa had seen it. She had looked at him when she heard Walt's bark of laughter, and she had seen the smile on Micah Kendrick's face, a face she had spent 6 weeks studying with the subtle attention she brought to most things, and she had registered it with the same precision she brought to thorns in a wound and seasoning in a gravy. She registered it and filed it away and said nothing about it. But that night, sitting on the porch of the main house after the men had gone back to their respective accommodations and Walt had gone to bed, Rosa sat alone in the dark for a while and thought about the smile on that careful, quiet face, and something she had been keeping at a careful distance shifted in her own chest in a way that was not entirely comfortable, because she had not come to the Double G looking for complications. She had, if she was honest with herself, come to the Double G looking for time to figure out what came next. She was 26 years old and had spent the last 2 years managing grief and practicalities and a sewing room in Santa Fe, where her employer, a woman named Mrs. Holloway, had made increasingly clear that she considered Rosa's presence a convenience and not a partnership, and had finally said something that crossed a line Rosa was not willing to stay on the wrong side of. She had packed her trunk and written to Uncle Walt, and Uncle Walt had replied within the week, "Come as long as you need. The ranch is big and I am lonely and could use someone who can cook better than Pete." She had not come expecting to be interested in anyone. She had certainly not come expecting to be interested in a foreman who had the conversational habits of a fence post and the emotional expressiveness of a mountain range present, solid, occasionally impressive, but not exactly forthcoming. But there was the smile, and it had been, in the brief time it existed, genuinely warm. The kind of warm that suggested there was something very much alive behind all that silence. She told herself it was not her concern. She was wrong, of course, but she was sensible enough to hold that position for at least a little while. Micah, for his part, did not know what to do with what had happened at that supper table. He had not thought about it consciously, but something had shifted, and he was aware of the shift the way you are aware of a change in weather before the clouds arrive, by a change in pressure, an alteration in the quality of the air. He threw himself into work with his customary complete commitment. It was July now, and the heat was serious, the kind that made the air above the scrubland shimmer and turned the horses irritable and the work harder. He was out before dawn every morning, and usually among the last in at night. He fixed the western fence section and helped Tamaz navigate a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Burgess over a shared water source that had been growing contentious all spring. He dealt with young Danny's snakebite, thankfully a minor one, from a small specimen, and the boy was fine after a day of rest and considerable drama, and reorganized the cattle rotation to make better use of the eastern pasture where the grass was still good. He did all of this, and he was good at it, and it occupied him. But he found himself, at supper on Sunday evenings, and occasionally in the afternoons when she crossed the yard, noticing Rosa Garner with a specificity he had not applied to another person in 7 years. He noticed that she read when she had idle time, actual books, ordered from Albuquerque, and that she sometimes read in the shade of the big cottonwood by the creek with a cup of coffee balanced on a flat rock beside her and the look of someone who is completely, contentedly alone in the world. He noticed that she had an ongoing project of improving the garden behind the main house, which had been essentially a patch of dirt with some scraggly herbs, and that she was methodical about it, consulting a book on desert gardening she had found somewhere and testing things with a kind of patient scientific attention. He noticed that she was gentle with the ranch horses, not in a showy way, but in the way of someone who understood animals and respected them, and that the old bay mare Walt kept for light riding had developed an obvious preference for Rosa's company. He also noticed that when Walt's neighbor, a rancher named Harold Fenster, came to call one afternoon and spent considerable time on the porch directing his conversation primarily at Rosa in a way that had some purpose to it, Micah found a reason to be in the main yard for the duration of the visit, and found himself paying close attention to the fence post nearest the porch for no reason he was prepared to fully examine. Rosa handled Fenster with the same composed directness she handled everything, neither encouraging nor being rude, and Fenster left at dusk without having accomplished whatever he had come to accomplish. Micah went back to work and told himself he had merely been conveniently near the fence post. It was Tamaz who said something about it, because Tamaz was 48 years old and Mexican-born, and had been working cattle ranches in the New Mexico territory since before some of the other hands were born, and he had seen enough of human nature to recognize it when it was sitting 12 feet away pretending to inspect fence hardware. "She is a fine woman," Tamaz said in his careful English, not looking at Micah, just working the post beside him. "She is," Micah agreed, in the tone of someone agreeing with a weather observation. "Very sensible," Tamaz continued. "Yes." "It is good when a sensible woman laughs," Tamaz said thoughtfully. "It means she really finds something funny, not just being polite." Micah said nothing. He tightened the wire on the post with more concentration than it required. "I notice you smiled at supper," Tamaz said, and this time there was a note of something in his voice that was gentle and careful, the way you are careful with something that might be fragile. "Last Sunday, Walt told me." Micah was quiet for a long moment. The sun was hot on the back of his neck and the wire was taut now, and there was really no further reason to be working this post. "Walt talks too much," he said finally. "He is happy about it," Tamaz said simply. "We all are. You are a good man, Micah. It is good to see a good man remember that he is alive." Micah set down the wire tool and looked out across the valley where the cattle moved like slow brown clouds across the yellow grass, and he did not say anything, and Tamaz did not push him, and eventually they both went back to work. But that night Micah lay on his bunk in the bunkhouse and stared at the dark ceiling and thought. In the plain and unsentimental way he thought about most things, about what being alive actually meant now. He had spent 7 years doing the work of a living man without quite believing in the enterprise. He had existed, which was not the same thing. He had been efficient and steady and present in all the ways that mattered to the work, and hollow in the ways that did not directly affect the work, and he had told himself that this was fine. This was what was available to him. This was the reasonable thing. And then a woman with flour on her apron had made a joke about a rooster and a cattle crossing, and he had smiled, and his face had remembered what that meant before his mind did. He thought about Emma. He thought about her the way he always did when she came into his mind, directly, because evasion was not something he was built for. He thought about her dark hair and the way she used to hum in the kitchen, and the baby that had not breathed long enough to be named, and the way he had stood outside the doctor's house in Abilene for 2 days before he had been able to go in and then come out and ride away. He thought about all of that and he felt the grief, real and present, and he did not try to stop it. But something was different from the 7 years of nights before this one. Because before, after the grief, there had been only emptiness, and tonight, after the grief, there was something else. Not a replacement, not a filling in. Just a small, distinct presence at the edge of the emptiness, like a lamp in the window of a house you are not yet sure you are allowed to approach. He slept, finally, better than he had in a while. In the morning he was up before anyone, which was normal for him, and he was in the yard when Rosa came out to the kitchen with the lantern still burning inside the main house, and she had her hair loose because it was very early, and she was carrying a covered pot, and she saw him and said, "Good morning," in a plain voice. "Morning," he said. She went into the kitchen. He saddled his horse and went out to the eastern pasture to check the cattle. But he thought about the loose hair and the plain good morning for longer than any reasonable accounting suggested he should. The summer deepened. The work did not stop. It never stopped on a working ranch, and Micah continued to be good at his job, which meant he and Rosa were in the same orbit regularly, and without the artificiality of arranged proximity. She brought water out to the men working on the barn repair in August when the heat was fiercest. He helped her when the garden needed a section of fence built to keep the rabbits out, and they worked side by side for a pleasant hour in the early morning, her directing and him building, and she had opinions about the fence that were specific and correct, which he appreciated. During that fence-building morning, they talked more than they had in any single stretch before. She told him about the garden book and the fact that she was trying to grow tomatoes, which was ambitious given the climate, and that she had a theory about soil drainage that she was testing. He told her, without quite planning to, that his grandmother had grown tomatoes in Tennessee by burying fish scraps near the roots, and that she had grown the best tomatoes he had ever tasted. Rosa turned and looked at him with the bright, interested expression of someone receiving a genuinely useful piece of information. "Fish scraps," she repeated. She swore by it, he said. I think it was the nitrogen. I don't know where I'd get fish scraps out here, she said, looking at the garden fence with the expression of someone doing calculations. The creek has catfish, he said, after a storm. She looked at him and then at the garden. Well, she said, with that small private smile she had, I suppose the catfish are about to become contributors. He almost smiled. He caught it before it fully formed, which he was aware of, which meant he was aware that there was something to catch, which meant something had changed in him. Rosa had noticed the almost smile too. She said nothing about it and they finished the fence. In September, two things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Walt Greer got sick. It began as what seemed like a summer cold, but it settled in his chest and did not improve, and the doctor from Creston Flats, a young man named Dr. Aldrich, who was competent and careful, rode out to the ranch and listened to Walt's lungs and said the words pneumonia with a measured gravity that communicated both the seriousness and the hope. Rosa became, in that week, the axis around which the household turned. She managed Walt's care with the same composed practicality she brought to everything, following Dr. Aldrich's instructions precisely, making sure the room was properly aired and not too cold and not too warm, preparing broths and light foods that Walt would actually eat, sitting with him in the evenings and reading to him from whatever book she had at hand. She did not fall apart. She did not dramatize. She worried. Micah could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the extra precision of her movements, in the way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window looking out without seeing anything, but she managed it quietly and kept going. Micah managed the ranch with the same completeness. He kept Walt informed of the essential business in the brief windows when Walt was feeling clear-headed enough for it, and he made the decisions that needed making, and he sent word to Walt's son in Texas, who arrived 8 days in and was a decent man named Joe who knew cattle well enough and was grateful to find the operation running cleanly. Walt began improving in the second week. He was out of danger by the third week, thinner and tired but coherent and deeply annoyed by the restrictions on his activity, which Rosa enforced with a cheerful implacability that made both Walt and Joe laugh, and which Micah observed from his customary orbit with something that was, he recognized now, a great deal of warmth. The second thing that happened in September was a man from Micah's past. His name was Dale Crowder, and he arrived at the Double G on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September looking for Micah. He was a man Micah had known during the cattle-driving years, not a friend exactly, but someone he had worked alongside briefly in Kansas, a man who had always been on the edge of things, interested in shortcuts that had to be taken in the dark. Crowder had, it emerged, come with a proposition. He had information about a land claim dispute that could be resolved, he suggested, by someone with Micah's evident position on a well-established ranch being willing to attest to certain details he had not personally witnessed. The implications were clear enough. The money involved was specific and not inconsiderable. Micah listened to all of this in the yard with the quiet patience he brought to things he had already decided, and then he said, "No," with a completeness that made Crowder's face change. "Micah, it's no," Micah said again. "You should ride back to wherever you came from, Dale." Crowder looked at him for a moment, reading his face, and whatever he found there was sufficient. He rode away. Micah stood in the yard for a moment and then turned and found Rosa in the doorway of the main house, having apparently just come out and seen the tail end of the exchange. She looked at him with a direct question in her expression. "Someone I used to know," he said. "Wanted something I wasn't going to give him." She looked at him a moment more. "All right," she said simply, and went back inside. He stood in the yard another moment and felt something he had almost forgotten, the texture of the specific piece of having been seen make a choice, and having that choice be accepted without negotiation, without qualification, without requiring explanation. Just all right. Just that he had made the right call and she had registered it, and that was enough. He went back to work, but he carried that feeling all day like something carefully cupped in both hands. October came in cold and bright, with an early frost that whitened the pastures at dawn and burned off by noon, and left the afternoon air crystalline and sharp. Walt was recovered enough to sit on the porch in the afternoons wrapped in a blanket and receive reports, and Joe Greer had gone back to Texas with the understanding that he would return in the spring, and the ranch had settled back into its rhythms. The Sunday suppers continued. They had become, over the months, a different quality of thing from what they had started as. Walt talked less about business and more about whatever was on his mind: old stories, opinions about the state of the territory, questions about the books Rosa was reading. Rosa talked more than she had in those early weeks, which Micah understood now was not because she had been reticent, but because she was someone who engaged most fully with people who had shown themselves worth engaging with. And Micah, almost without noticing the incremental steps of the process, had started talking. Not constantly. Not in the warm, rolling way of Walt, who was constitutionally inclined toward the filling of silence, but specifically, honestly. He answered questions with more than one sentence. He offered observations when they occurred to him. He told the story of his grandmother's tomatoes in more detail, which made Rosa ask about Tennessee, and he told her about Tennessee with the careful precision of someone unpacking something that has been stored for a long time and finding it intact. Rosa listened the way she did everything completely, without performing the listening, just actually hearing. He told her, one evening in early October, about Emma. Not everything, not the specific details of the worst of it, but the essential fact of it. A wife, a child, a fever, 7 years ago. He said it plainly, looking at his coffee cup, and when he finished he looked up and found her watching him with an expression that was not pity and not detachment, but something that sat squarely between them: full understanding, full acknowledgement, full presence. "I am sorry," she said, "truly." "I know," he said, because he did know. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to say that grief doesn't get smaller. It just stops being the only thing in the room." He considered this. "Is that what happened with your father and then your mother?" "It is," she said, slowly and not in a straight line. They sat for a moment, and the fire in the hearth made sounds, and somewhere outside a coyote said something to the dark and was answered from a distance. "What was she like?" Rosa asked, gently, not pressing but genuinely asking because she was a person who wanted to know actual things about actual people. He thought about it. "She was very sure of herself," he said. "About most things. She wasn't always right, but she was always sure. I found that calming, when I was younger." Rosa smiled, small and real. "That's a very honest way to remember someone." "She deserves honest remembering," he said. Rosa nodded. "Yes, she does." They moved on to other things after that, and the evening ended as evenings did, and he went back to the bunkhouse in the cold October night and stood for a moment looking at the main house windows with their lamplight warmth. And he did not have a name yet for what he was feeling, but he was not going to insult it by pretending it wasn't there. Rosa, for her part, had arrived at her own moment of honesty sometime around late September, sitting with her book by the creek, looking at the page without reading it, and acknowledging to herself with complete directness that she thought about Micah Kendrick considerably more than was explained by proximity and shared meals. She thought about his hands when he worked. She thought about the way he listened. She thought about the smile at the supper table and what it had meant that it had taken 6 weeks and a joke about a rooster to produce it. She thought about the quiet, complete decency of how he had handled everything: the sick cattle, the fence dispute, Walt's illness, the man who had come wanting something wrong. She also thought honestly about the grief. She was not naive about it. He had loved someone and lost them, and that had shaped him into his current form as thoroughly as anything shapes a person. She did not want to minimize that or compete with it or pretend it was not real. She also knew, because she had loved her own parents and lost them and survived and kept going, that grief and living were not mutually exclusive. They could occupy the same person. They had to. She thought all of this sitting by the creek, and then she looked at the water and thought, I am going to allow myself to care about this person. I am going to allow it to be whatever it is. And if it is nothing, then it is nothing and I will be all right. But I am not going to pretend. She was, above all things, a woman who did not pretend. November arrived with serious cold and the preparations that came with it, additional feed storage, weatherproofing the bunkhouse, getting the horses sorted for the winter season. The ranch contracted in winter the way all things in the high desert did, drawing in and making itself smaller against the cold, and the hands spent more time in the warmth of the bunkhouse and less time out on the range. There was a social event in Creston Flats in November, a harvest dance at the church hall, which was a fixture of the calendar, and attended by most of the region with the kind of enthusiastic relief of people who had been working hard all year and wanted one evening of something else. Walt, still not fully robust but improving steadily, declared he was going, and Rosa was going with him, and he asked Micah to come along, and Micah said yes before he had considered the question very carefully. The dance was held on a Friday evening, and the hall was warm and full of people, and the fiddle players were genuinely good. Walt found his contemporaries immediately and was absorbed into a warm circle of ranchers and their wives. Rosa had worn a dress Micah had not seen before, not fancy. This was not a fancy occasion, but a deep red color that suited her considerably, and her hair was down and pinned differently, and she looked like herself, but with the particular quality of someone who has made a small, deliberate effort that means something. Micah stood near the wall for a while in his good shirt. He had a good shirt. He had worn it only twice before and watched the dancing and the room with the habitual attention of a man who is used to taking the measure of environments. Rosa was beside him, also watching, holding a cup of the cider that was being distributed. "Do you dance?" she asked him after a while. "I used to," he said. "So did I," she said. "I find I'd like to again." He looked at her. She was looking at the dancers on the floor with the expression she had when she was thinking about something practically. He recognized this now after months of learning her. She was thinking, he understood, about whether to want a thing out loud or keep it contained, and she had just decided to want it out loud, which was very Rosa. "Then we should," he said. She looked at him and her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a slight recalibration, as if she had expected some resistance and was adjusting for the absence of it. And then she smiled, not the small private smile she had for most things, but a fuller one, warm and genuine, and she said, "All right then." They danced. He had not danced in more than 7 years and the first steps were uncertain, but the music had a simple, insistent quality and his body remembered the mechanics, and Rosa was easy to dance with because she was light on her feet and followed well, and when he missed a step she adjusted without comment. They danced 2 dances and then stood for one and then danced a slower one, and in the slower one the proximity was different, real proximity, her hand in his other hand on the small of her back, close enough that he could hear her breathing over the music. He was very aware of everything, the warmth of the room, the fiddle, the way she looked up at him with those frank brown eyes during the slower music and did not look away. The fact that he was holding her hand and it felt, in the specific way that true things feel, like something that made sense. He said quietly, because they were close enough that quiet worked, "I'm glad I came tonight." She looked at him with a directness that was warm. "So am I." They did not say anything else important, but there was an understanding established by the end of the evening that had not been there at the beginning, something neither of them named but both of them carried home. Walt, in the wagon on the ride back, did a poor job of concealing his satisfaction, which showed itself primarily in the whistling he did for the first 2 miles. Rosa told him to stop whistling. He whistled one more bar and then stopped, smiling in the dark. Micah rode alongside the wagon on his horse and said nothing, which was normal, but there was a difference in the quality of his silence that anyone who had been paying attention for months would have recognized. The following week, Micah found Rosa at the creek in the late afternoon of a clear, cold day, sitting on the flat rock with her book, and he walked down to her and asked, with the direct and slightly formal manner of a man who has been rehearsing something and is now delivering it, whether she would allow him to call on her. Rosa looked up from her book. She had clearly heard every word and was clearly not surprised by them, and she considered him for a moment, not weighing whether she wanted to say yes, he understood, but deciding on the proper form of the yes. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." He nodded once. "Good," he said, and then, because he did not have a natural gear between formal declaration and silence, he said, "I'll good," and walked back to the barn. Rosa looked back at her book and read the same sentence 4 times without taking it in, and finally gave up and sat looking at the creek instead. With a smile, she made no effort to contain, because there was no one to see it. Walt, when told the following Sunday, reacted with the restrained dignity of a man who does not wish to undermine his own authority by being visibly delighted, and then was visibly delighted for the rest of the evening, and told a story about how he had known something was up since July. The courtship, because that was what it was, settled into the forms that suited both of them. Micah would come to the main house on evenings when work permitted, and they would sit on the porch or by the fire depending on the weather, and they talked. They talked the way 2 people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's actual minds. About the ranch, about the territory, about what she was reading, about what the land looked like in spring, about where he had traveled and what he had seen, about her parents, about his grandmother who grew the extraordinary tomatoes. He told her piece by piece about his life before the double G in the measured and honest way he did things, and she listened with complete attention and never hurried him and never tried to interpret for him. She told him, in kind, about Santa Fe, about the seamstress work, about Mrs. Holloway, and the specifics of what had been said that had been a step too far. He listened, and his face did the thing it did sometimes now, a subtle tightening that was not quite an expression, but communicated clearly that he had an opinion about people who mistreated people who were working for them. He said, "You were right to leave," with a quiet certainty that was better than any elaborate sympathy. He told her once, sitting by the fire on a cold November evening, that he had not expected to want this. Another life, another possibility of one. He said it carefully, not to make her feel secondary but to be honest, because honest was what he had and what she deserved. She said with equal care, "I know, I think that's part of why I trust it." He looked at her. "If it came easily," she said, "it might not mean as much. The fact that it's something you're choosing carefully on purpose, that means more to me than if it had just happened without thought." He was quiet for a moment. "You are considerably smarter than me," he said. She smiled. "I have a different kind of smart. Yours is useful too." He asked her, one December evening when the first real snow had come down thin and white over the valley and made everything quiet, whether she had thought about what she wanted for the future. Not pressingly, not as an ultimatum, but with the genuine curiosity of a man who wanted to understand the shape of her life as she imagined it. She was quiet for a moment, serious the way she got when she was thinking through something honestly. "I want to stay somewhere," she said. "I've been in motion for long enough. I want to be somewhere that is mine, a proper home, a kitchen that is actually mine, and a garden that I don't have to leave." She paused. "I want children someday. I think I would be a good mother." She said this without false modesty. It was an honest assessment, not a boast. "You would," he said immediately, with the calm certainty of a man who has been watching her manage everything from Walt's illness to Danny's snakebite to rabbit-proofed garden fences. She looked at him, a little startled by the immediacy of it. "You're steady and warm and you don't fall apart," he said. "And you're funny, which matters more than people say." She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and something passed between them that neither of them tried to put into words, but it was the kind of moment that you know, while it is happening, that you will remember for the rest of your life. "What about you?" she asked softly. He thought about it honestly. "Same," he said. "Staying, a home that is mine. I've been moving since I was 24. He was quiet a moment. "I'd like a family again someday. I thought I wouldn't for a long time, but I'd like one." She reached over, slowly and deliberately, and covered his hand on the arm of the chair with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the firelight and the winter quiet, and the snow continued outside, and there was not a single thing in the world that needed saying. He asked Walt Greer for permission to court Rosa formally, which Walt gave immediately and with considerable relief. And then in December, on a clear cold day with the mountains visible to the north in that sharp winter way where every ridge was distinct, Micah took Rosa out on the bay mare while he rode his own horse, and they went up to the top of the eastern ridge where you could see the whole of the Double G Valley spread below, and he asked her to marry him. He was direct about it, because that was what he knew how to be. He got down from his horse and she dismounted, and they stood in the cold air with the view behind them, and he said he loved her, the first time he had said those words out loud in 7 years, and they came out a little rough but they came out true, and that he wanted to build a life with her, a real one, not the existing without living that he'd been doing for too long, and that he understood she was worth more than what he had at the moment, but that he planned to spend the rest of his life making sure she had everything she needed, and he was hoping she would let him try. Rosa looked at him in that direct, whole way she had, and her eyes were bright in the cold, and she said yes with the same simplicity and fullness that she brought to everything that mattered. He kissed her for the first time then, standing on the ridge with the valley below and the mountains beyond, and it was careful and certain and warm, and she kissed him back with a completeness that said everything her spare way with words didn't. They rode back down to the ranch in the afternoon light and told Walt, who had apparently been watching from the porch with some attention, because he had a blanket over his shoulders and was positioned at an angle that suggested the ridge had been visible from his vantage point, and he had been making use of this fact. He embraced Rosa and shook Micah's hand for a long time, and then he went inside and came back with a bottle of something good he had been keeping, and they had a drink, the 3 of them, by the fire that evening. Old Pete, when told the following morning, said about time, with the brevity of a man who had been watching this develop for months and was relieved to have it resolved. They were married in March of 1884 in the church in Creston Flats, with Walt walking Rosa down the aisle because there was no one with a better claim to that honor. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself over the winter ivory cotton, with small embroidered flowers at the collar and sleeves, precise and lovely, and her hair was pinned with a small spray of dried wildflowers that she had pressed in the summer, and saved without knowing exactly why at the time, but understanding now. Micah stood at the front of the church in his good shirt with a new vest he had bought from the tailor in Creston Flats, and when Rosa came down the aisle on Walt's arm, he watched her walk toward him and felt, with a completeness he had not felt in years, like himself. Not the reduced, careful, going through the motions version of himself that had been managing things since Abilene, but the actual version, the one that was capable of being fully present in his own life. She reached him and they stood together and said their vows, both of them in clear voices with steady eyes, and when the preacher had them say the words and they did, there was nothing tentative or reserved about it. The whole church could see that these 2 people meant every syllable. Tamaz was there, grinning broadly. Caleb managed an expression of genuine pleasure. Young Danny cried, which surprised everyone including Danny, and he spent a good deal of the reception afterward claiming it was dust from the road. They had a supper that Rosa had largely planned and mostly refused help with, because it was the kind of practical orchestration she was good at, and she wanted it done her way, and the food was, by every account offered that evening, exceptional. There was roasted pork and cornbread, and 3 kinds of vegetable dish and 2 pies, and nobody left hungry, and Walt made a speech that was both embarrassing and genuinely lovely, and Micah held Rosa's hand under the table through most of it. They moved into the foreman's house, a separate structure Walt had been meaning to properly fix up for years, and had done so in a concentrated burst of activity starting in January, once he was healthy enough to direct operations. It was small but solid. 2 main rooms downstairs, a bedroom, a kitchen that was real and properly equipped, a porch that faced east so you got the morning sun. Rosa installed herself in it with the quiet, purposeful efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this and knows what to do with it. Within a week, the kitchen smelled like something wonderful at all hours. Within 2 weeks, the small garden plot behind the house had been turned and assessed and planned. Within a month, there were curtains on the windows that she had made herself and a rag rug by the door, and a row of her books on the shelf Micah had built for her. And the whole place had the quality of being genuinely lived in by people who wanted to be there. They settled into the rhythms of a shared life, the way they had settled into everything practically, directly, with a minimum of drama and a maximum of intention. They had their differences. She was neater than he was, which she addressed by being specific about it rather than aggrieved. He was more taciturn in the mornings than she preferred, which she addressed by having coffee ready and requiring nothing of him conversationally until the second cup. She liked to talk through decisions from every angle before settling on them. He tended toward action and had to practice slowing down. He got impatient with inefficiency. She had more patience for the irregular rhythms of people and processes, but they were, fundamentally, working in the same direction with the same values, and that made everything else navigable. He smiled at her now, regularly. Not as a performance and not as an obligation, but because she continued to regularly produce the conditions under which his face simply forgot to be serious. Something she said at supper, something she did in the garden, a look she gave him from across the yard, the specific quality of her company in the evenings when they were both reading and the fire was going and the ranch was quiet outside. Once she caught him smiling at her from across the kitchen when she was making bread and hadn't been saying anything particularly interesting, just working, and she looked up and saw it and said, "What are you smiling at?" And he said, with a directness that made her stop kneading entirely, "You, just you." She stood for a moment with her flour-covered hands still and looked at him, and then looked back at her bread and said nothing. But he could see the side of her face from where he sat, and he could see the smile that she was, with complete unsuccessfulness, attempting to keep under control. Spring came to the Double G in the way it came to the high desert, suddenly and with great conviction, the creek running high with snowmelt, the pastures going green so fast it seemed like paint, the mountains across the valley wearing their last snow on the high peaks like something ceremonial. The cattle that had wintered lean began to round out, the horses got full of energy and opinions, and the whole ranch shook off the winter and went back to its full pace. Walt was fully healthy now, genuinely recovered, and the combination of good food and purpose had him looking better than he had in years. He took a great deal of satisfaction in the state of the ranch, in the competence of his foreman, and in the fact that the foreman's wife produced exceptional food for the Sunday dinners that Walt had now extended to every Wednesday as well, on the grounds that midweek needed something to anchor it. Micah's work as foreman had deepened over the year into something more than competent management. He had begun to understand the Double G as a place with its own character and potential, not just a job to be done well. He talked to Walt about expanding the eastern pasture, about improving the water management on the south section where the creek was sometimes unreliable, about adding to the remuda with a focus on quality over quantity. Walt listened to all of this with the pleasure of a man whose trust had been well placed. In the spring, Rosa's tomatoes came up. Not just came up, grew with a confidence that she attributed, with quiet scientific pride, to the combination of her soil work and the catfish nitrogen experiment she had been refining since the previous year. They were extraordinary tomatoes. By August of 1884 she had more than she knew what to do with, and she started putting up jars with a focused energy that filled the kitchen with warmth and steam and the rich smell of cooked tomatoes. Micah ate tomatoes in every form she could devise for 3 weeks and found this not at all difficult. "You should be selling these," he said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table watching her work. She looked up from the jar she was sealing. "The tomatoes, the jars, the preserved ones. People in town would pay for this." She considered it. The considering look she had, the one where she went quiet and did the internal accounting. "Then, I'd need more jars." "I can get more jars," he said. She sealed the jar she was holding and set it in the line with the others and said, "All right, let's try it." She sold preserved tomatoes and 2 kinds of jam and a pepper relish at the general store in Creston Flats that fall. It was modest money, but it was hers, which mattered to her not because of Micah's generosity, which was real, but because she had always preferred to contribute rather than simply receive. Micah understood this without requiring it to be explained, and was quietly proud of it in the specific way. He was quietly proud of most things she did, which was by paying attention. The other news of the autumn of 1884 was that Rosa was expecting. She told him on an October evening, standing in the kitchen by the window, with the plain directness she brought to important things. She had suspected for several weeks, and had been confirming it to her own satisfaction before saying anything, because that was how she operated. He stood very still for a moment when she said it. She watched him carefully, not worried exactly, but attentive, because she knew the history this touched on, and she wanted to see what it did to him and be present with whatever that was. What it did was something complex and visible, moving across his face the way weather moves across the valley, first a stillness, then something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of what had been lost refracted through what was now being offered again. And then, through that, and not replacing it but coexisting with it with a completeness that was its own kind of wonder, joy. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a moment and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said. "Good," he said. "Good." And he held her for a long time in the kitchen with the lamplight going and the desert night outside, and she could feel him breathing, steady and warm, and she put her arms around him and they stayed like that until the lamp needed turning up against the dark. He was, through the months that followed, attentive in the particular way that is built on actual attention rather than anxiety. He did not hover. He did not treat her as fragile. She would not have tolerated that, and he knew it. He made sure the firewood was always split and stacked, and the kitchen was warm in the mornings, and that he was back from the range by a reasonable hour, and he listened to Dr. Aldrich's guidance with the same careful precision he brought to instructions about anything important, and he was present in the way that mattered. They talked about the baby in the evenings. They talked about names, about the room that would need arranging, about what Walt would say, Walt who had already indicated an intention to be the most active uncle in the territory. They talked about Emma's child too, once, carefully and honestly, because Rosa had asked once whether he wanted to talk about it and he had said yes, and so they did. He told her about the boy who had not been named in time. She sat with that grief alongside him without trying to fix it, and at the end he said, "I think about him still. I think I always will." "Of course you will," she said. "He was yours. And this one is ours," he said, with a steadiness that was also an arrival. Their son was born in June of 1885, on a morning when the light through the bedroom window was gold and the meadowlarks were going strong in the pasture. Dr. Aldrich was present, and Walt was in the main house refusing to go anywhere with a determined anxiety that the hands found touching. And young Danny, no longer quite so young, having grown considerably in the 2 years since the snake bite, and now a reliable and genuinely capable ranch hand, paced the yard with the general aspect of a person who has appointed himself keeper of the tension. The birth was hard, as births were, but Rosa was strong, and Dr. Aldrich was competent, and when it was over and the baby was in his mother's arms, crying the strong, particular cry of a healthy newborn. Micah was there beside the bed with his hand over Rosa's hand, and the look on his face was the look of a man who is standing in the middle of everything he did not believe he would ever have again. They named him Thomas Walt Kendrick. Thomas for Micah's father, Walt for the man who had given them the place where their life had found its shape. Walt, when he met Thomas, held him with the careful reverence of a large man handling something unexpectedly precious and said, "Lord, he's something," in a voice that was slightly unsteady, and then cleared his throat with great vigor and said something about the cattle that no one believed was what he was really thinking about. Thomas was something. He was robust and loud in his opinions, and had, from the first weeks, a directness about his needs that Rosa found familiar and Micah found both challenging and deeply recognizable. He grew the way healthy babies do, fast and with great determination, and the foreman's house acquired the particular transformed quality of a house with a baby in it, full of the small necessities and large emotions of new parenthood. Micah learned fatherhood with the same deliberate thoroughness he brought to everything. He was not naturally instinctive with infants. He was careful in the way he was careful with anything he might inadvertently damage. But he paid attention. He asked questions. He watched Rosa with Thomas and took in what she showed him. And by the time Thomas was 3 months old, he could get the boy settled as efficiently as anyone. Rosa watched him with Thomas and felt, each time, something that expanded beyond what she had words for. The sight of this quiet, careful, once stone-faced man holding their son and talking to him in the low, specific way he talked to things he was taking seriously. Not baby talk, just plain talking, telling Thomas about the horses or the weather or the state of the fence on the north section, was a sight that reorganized her entire interior every time she saw it. She had not known, when she came to the Double G with her single trunk and her grief and her practical self-possession, that this was what was waiting. She had not expected it. She had hoped for stability and found a life. She had hoped for a decent situation and found a person who was, when he was fully present in his own life, extraordinary in all the quiet, sturdy, essential ways that the world most needed. The summer of 1885 was one of the best the Double G had seen in years. The cattle prices held well, the rains came at the right times, and the eastern pasture expansion that Micah had been arguing for since the previous year showed its value in the weight of the cattle that grazed it. Walt declared that business had never been better and attributed this to good management, with a gratitude that was large and genuine. Tamaz got married that fall to a woman from Albuquerque named Kanka, who was formidably intelligent and who took to Rosa immediately. And there was a wedding celebration at the ranch that was large and warm and went late into the night with music and good food, and Thomas being passed from arm to arm by people who were clearly going to be extremely spoiled by this child's easy sociability. Micah danced with Rosa at Tamaz's wedding, better than he had at the harvest dance 2 years prior, and she laughed when he executed a complicated turn with unexpected confidence and said, "You've been practicing." "I have," he said without embarrassment. "When?" she demanded, delighted. "In the barn," he said, "when no one was around." She laughed fully, completely, the real laugh that came out only when something caught her genuinely unprepared, and he smiled at her, that smile that had started with a joke about a rooster and a cattle crossing and had never really gone away since. The year turned and Thomas began to crawl and then, with terrifying determination, to walk, grabbing furniture and human legs with equal democratic enthusiasm. He had Micah's dark eyes and Rosa's coloring, and the very specific combination of their temperaments, which meant he was quiet and attentive until he had decided on a course of action, and then completely unstoppable. He thought about things before he did them, but once he decided, nothing short of an act of Congress was going to change his direction. Rosa thought this was deeply funny. Micah thought it was perfectly reasonable and did not understand why everyone else found it noteworthy. Thomas's first word, at 11 months, was not mama or dada but horse, delivered with great conviction while pointing at the window from which the paddock was visible. And Micah's response was to look at Rosa with the expression of someone who has just been told something that confirms a deeply held hypothesis. Winter of 1885 going into 1886 was a cold one, the kind that settled in with intent and did not soften until March. The double G came through it well. Micah's preparations had been thorough, but the cold meant long evenings indoors and the particular intimacy of shared warmth. Thomas slept in the small room they had arranged for him, and in the evenings Micah and Rosa sat by the fire, and the life they had built arranged itself around them with the quality of something complete. It was in one of those evenings that Rosa told him she was expecting again, and the second time he did not need the moment of adjustment. He simply looked at her and said, with a certainty and a warmth that arrived together, "Good." And she laughed at the simplicity of it, and he reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, gentle and deliberate, and they sat together in the firelight while Thomas slept in the next room, and the cold wind talked to itself outside. Their second child was a girl born in August of 1886, delivered again by Dr. Aldrich with Rosa's customary combination of intensity and composure, and she was small and loud, and had a great deal of opinion about the world from the very first hour. They named her Marion, after Rosa's mother. Walt met Marion with the same trembling reverence he had met Thomas, and said, "Lord," again, and then collected himself and said she was going to be something else, and he was not wrong. Having 2 children under 2 years old was a quantity of work that reorganized everything, and they managed it the way they managed most things together, practically, without drama, and occasionally with a humor born of mutual exhaustion. Micah could be found at unusual hours doing various things, walking Thomas in the yard in the early morning while Rosa fed Marion, fixing things one-handed while holding Marion, attempting to have a serious conversation with Caleb about fence maintenance, while Thomas sat on his boot determinedly trying to remove his spur. He was, by every measure, extraordinarily happy. He was not always comfortable, 2 children and ranch management, and the ordinary difficulties of life in the territory in 1886 were not a recipe for constant comfort. But he was happy in the deep, grounded way that comes from being where you are supposed to be, doing what you are supposed to be doing, with the people you are supposed to be with. Rosa, watching him one afternoon from the kitchen window as he walked Thomas around the paddock, pointing out each horse by name to a small boy who was very interested in horses, thought about the stone-faced man who had ridden into the yard 3 years before with those hollowed-out eyes and that complete, unbroken quiet. She thought about the 6 weeks before his first smile, and the way it had arrived so suddenly and so completely, and how it had become, by increments, the most regular feature of her days. She thought about her mother's words, "Grief doesn't get smaller, it just stops being the only thing in the room." She had been right. The grief was still there, his for Emma and the child, hers for her parents, and it was real and it was honored and it was not pretended away. But it lived now in a house full of other things, alongside the smells of good cooking and the sound of Thomas's developing opinions and Marion's considerable volume, and the easy comfort of a man who had come back from 7 years of absence from his own life and chosen, on purpose, every single day to be here. She tapped on the window glass. Micah looked up. She held up a cup of coffee and raised an eyebrow. He nodded, that single quiet nod she had learned to read as fluently as language, and she poured the second cup and went out onto the porch to sit in the afternoon sun and wait for him to bring their son inside and come sit beside her. He came across the yard with Thomas on his hip, and he climbed the porch steps, and he sat down next to her and accepted the cup, and Thomas immediately attempted to take the cup, and there was a brief negotiation about that, and then Thomas was redirected to a very important stick he had found, and they sat in the sun and drank their coffee, and the valley was golden around them. "Marion is asleep," Rosa said. "I know," he said. "She'll be up in an hour demanding the world." "She will," he said. A brief and comfortable silence. "I found another section of fence down on the west side," he said. "The wire or the post? Post. I'll get to it tomorrow." Thomas showed him the stick with great urgency. Micah examined the stick with appropriate gravity and confirmed it was an excellent stick. Thomas was satisfied and returned to his investigation of the porch boards. "Walt wants to come to supper on Sunday," Rosa said. "Good," Micah said. "I need to talk to him about the water management on the south section anyway." Rosa looked at him with a small private smile. "And perhaps we could eat supper first and talk about water management second." He looked at her, and there it was, the smile, easy and full and present in the way it had not been for 7 years before her. "We could," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the afternoon sun, and he shifted so his arm was around her. And Thomas continued his examination of the porch with the complete concentration of a person for whom porch boards are the whole world. And the horses moved in the paddock, and the meadowlarks were going in the pasture, and the September sky over the mountains was the color of the inside of a shell. 3 years prior, on a spring afternoon in 1883, a man with a worn duster and empty eyes had ridden into the Double G yard and begun, without knowing it, the long walk back to his own life. He had not known then what was waiting a woman with flour on her apron and frank brown eyes, and a wit that could catch you sideways without warning. He had not known about the Sunday suppers, or the rooster joke, or the dance at the harvest hall, or the ridge in December with the whole valley spread below. He had not known about Thomas's voice saying horse with the conviction of a small prophet, or Marion's comprehensive opinions about the world, or the particular warmth of the foreman's house on a cold night with the fire going, and the people he loved inside it. He had not known any of it. But he had, on a Sunday evening in June of 1883, said something at a supper table that was funny enough to make him forget to stop smiling, and something in his face had remembered what it meant to be alive before his mind caught up. And he had been, ever since and without interruption, learning to be grateful for that. Walt Greer came to Sunday supper that week, and Old Pete joined them because Old Pete had decided that his beans were more than adequate for a special occasion, and Walt had learned not to argue with him about it. And the table was full, and the food was extraordinary as it always was when Rosa cooked, and the conversation went around the table with the warmth of people who know each other well and are glad to be together. At some point in the evening, Walt said something about one of the neighboring ranchers that was funny in an unintentional way, and Rosa said something in response that was funny in a very intentional way. And Micah Kendrick sat at his table in his home with his wife and his children and his friends around him, and laughed, really laughed, full and warm and present, and every single person at the table stopped for a moment just to hear it, because it was the sound of a man who had come back all the way. And it was the best sound the Double G had known in a long time. Thomas, who was sitting in the high chair Micah had built for him, and had been working on a piece of cornbread with intense concentration, looked up at the sound of his father's laughter and smiled with the complete and uncalculating joy of a child who has just heard something wonderful. Rosa looked at Micah from across the table, and he looked at her, and what passed between them in that look was everything, all of it. The whole long road from the hollow-eyed man at the water trough to this table this evening, this life complete and warm and fully, finally, gloriously theirs. He had not smiled in 7 years. She had said something at the supper table, and he had forgotten to stop. And there, in the high desert of New Mexico territory, in the golden autumn of 1886, at a table full of people who loved each other and food that was exactly right and a life that had been built on honesty and care, and the quiet, stubborn courage of 2 people who had each carried their grief and chosen on purpose to keep living. There, in all of that, the story found its true shape. Not an ending, exactly. More like a beginning that had already been happening for 3 years and had every intention of continuing for the rest of their lives, through more winters and springs, through Thomas growing into his father's quiet certainty and Marion growing into her mother's sharp and particular intelligence, through more children perhaps. A third would come 2 years later, a boy they named Samuel, born in October when the cottonwoods were gold along the creek, and the whole valley looked like something from a painting. Through the seasons of the double G and the changing territory and the incremental shifts of a country still figuring out what it was, through all of it, the smile would stay. Not always visible, not always expressed in that exact way, but present, in the way he looked at her across a room, in the ease of his company, in the specific warmth he carried now in the geography of his face, in the fact that he was fully, wholly alive in his own life and knew it and was grateful for it every single day. He had not smiled in 7 years. And then he had. And the world, small and enormous all at once, had been entirely different ever since.